if you cannot be honest about your own coping mechanisms, the things that you run to for comfort, you will, if you can't be honest with yourself and other people, then you're never going to be able to change them. Leaving these things in a dark place only gives them more and more power and control over you. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to the Role Model Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Peterson, back again with another solo podcast with a topic that is near and dear to my heart. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about coping mechanisms. What's the difference between good and bad coping mechanisms? So last week on episode 1, which is super weird, doing individual podcasts for the first time, I talked about the catalyst event, the moments in our lives that force us to change. And for me, that was kind of reaching rock bottom after having idealized marriage and then failing twice at them. Coming to the realization that I was kind of floundering around, and when it all hit the fan, divorced twice, overweight, drinking too much, broke. My daughters didn't like me, didn't have a lot of friends at the time. That was enough for me to finally break and start to figure stuff out. I don't know if you remember from last week's episode, one of the first things I did when I got back to my house after I left my daughter's birthday party was dump out all of the alcohol, deleted social media, and really started to dig down into some habits, figuring out what are healthy habits. So today I wanted to talk about coping mechanisms because coping mechanisms are a bitch. So negative coping mechanisms include things like overconsumption of food, alcohol, weed, harder drugs. Obviously, those tend to become more obvious quickly because if you're on meth, you're like, do I need a house or my teeth? So people tend to intervene a little bit quicker because the problem is pretty obvious. If your problem is food, we live in a society that's normalized coping with food and actually prefers it. So like half of the stuff on the shelves of the grocery store immediately kind of fall into that. So then there's things like porn, shopping, video games, gambling, sex, doom scrolling, and then binge watching TV. So the difference between those and what we would call positive coping mechanisms, and positive coping mechanisms could be anything from, books, working out, honest conversation with friends, cooking, creative hobbies like writing, learning a sport, learning a new language, how to paint. All these things are healthy coping mechanisms. Meditation. And the difference between a positive and a negative coping mechanism is delayed gratification. So I don't know that if I've ever been around somebody that was, after a night of binging was like, man, yeah, that's exactly what I needed. I feel great now, ready to get up and start my day. There's a reason for that. Like the barrier to entry on negative coping mechanisms are really low, and they allow that anticipatory avoidance. So like we know something's coming up, we'd rather not do it, so we're going to divert our attention to something easier. And these negative coping mechanisms can really control our life. And furthermore, nowadays they can control everything. We have access to almost every negative coping mechanism on our phone, devices, computers. And so the barrier to entry is so low that people fall into these quicker than ever. And I did as well. And so the fight to get healthy and the fight to get back requires identifying some of these coping mechanisms. And for me, my coping mechanisms started to become addictions. And it's hard to use that language sometimes because it's polarized. Addiction sucks. And there's a lot of shame around being an addict to anything. And unfortunately for me, my coping mechanism for good chunk of my life was food. Food was the thing that I went to early in my life because it was the only thing accessible. So, having grown up in Utah and not being Mormon, and having an older brother, and his friends that would like pretty relentlessly, kick the shit out of me. I started coping relatively early in my life. I started probably second or third grade. I just wanted to be liked. I wanted to be part of a group. I wanted to be around people that wanted me around. And it was really hard to find that. And the result was when I couldn't, I started eating my feelings at the earliest ages. I remember coming home from school and, my mom would have frosting in the cupboard that she would use to make those boxed cakes. And I would eat an entire cake, can of frosting sometimes after school. And then as I started to cope more, I got fatter and fatter and more overweight. And the more overweight I got, the more I got bullied, which then caused me to uh, eat more. And the cycle just was relentless. I didn't have anybody in my life at a young age to kind of pull me out of that. I didn't have somebody in my life that, saw how heavy I was getting and was like, "Hey, are you okay?" Which is shitty. It sucks knowing that I was wearing my pain on my on my body, and there wasn't anybody around to actually kind of like step in and say something. And so we go down these paths of trying to get our needs met by ourselves. This is a byproduct of growing up, I think, in the generation that we did. I grew up in a house where my dad was gone for most of my childhood, pursuing his own dreams, and my mom worked a regular job in a manufacturing factory in Utah. And so while raising four kids, so we had very little money. And, the little bit of money that we did have often went towards buying, cheap food that was easy for us kids to prepare ourselves because my mom couldn't do it because she wasn't around. So we basically raised ourselves. So I neglected seeing that food was a coping mechanism for myself for a very long time. Um, I didn't fully understand it until I got married. So, for the majority of my life, using food as a coping mechanism, it never really impacted anybody else but me because, I would buy things. I would go to the grocery store, and when I would check out, I'd buy 3 candy bars and eat them on the way home. Or, like when nobody else was around, I would just pop over to Jack in the Box and buy, a couple of meals and eat them. And this was kind of a regular habit, if not daily, definitely multiple times a week. And then I would try to go to the extreme opposite, where when I felt out of control and I felt like shit, which was pretty much all the time, then I would try to diet and I would try to cut everything out. And then I would fail, and my failure would take me back into my coping mechanism even deeper than it was before. And I would eat more and shittier foods often. And it was just this cycle. It was a cycle that I accepted for the most part until I got married. And when I got married, what I didn't realize was that my coping mechanism was going to then impact my family, my wife at the time. So there was one day I was working in music, and I had an extremely stressful job. I was working as an executive assistant to this guy, Kenneth Creer, and then also doing day-to-day management for Janet Jackson because he managed Janet Jackson, and I was basically the person underneath him that kind of everything that came through our office regarding Janet fell on me, which required me to be up between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning because she lived in New York, and my boss told me if we get emails, he wants a response. So I had just gotten married, and we found out we were pregnant. And during this process, I was like I had ballooned up. I had gotten extremely big at this point. And so there's one day I'm going to the office, and oftentimes I would drive to the office early, and sometimes I would pick up donuts and leave them in the break room. So I stop at the office, or I stop at a donut shop on the way into the office because they're the only things that are open at like 5 in the morning. And I get a dozen donuts. Well, as I'm driving into the office, I end up eating like almost half of the box of donuts. So now I'm ashamed that I've eaten most of these donuts. So I decide to leave the box in my car because I'm embarrassed to take half a box of donuts into the office. Well, once we get into the office, somebody that gets in at like 8 o'clock brings bagels, and I go over and I have a big bagel with cream cheese. And at this point, I'm already drinking some sodas, oftentimes diet sodas, to try to offset the amount of sugar that I've been intaking. But there was also a bunch of candy in the office, so I would go and grab handfuls of candy throughout the day as well. So I probably had 2 or 3 handfuls of candy prior to lunch, when I go to Jersey Mike's and buy a giant sub, thinking that half of it I'll save for dinner and the other half I'll save for home. At lunch, I end up consuming the entire thing, plus a cookie, plus another soda. Go back to the office, and surprise, surprise, it's birthday cake day at the office. So, and our office had an ice cream machine. So I then proceed to have a piece of cake and a bowl of froyo from the office. And at this point, I am feeling awful about myself. So awful that when I got back in my car to drive home, I started to eat the rest of the donuts that were left in the car. And at this point, my calorie intake for the day was easily probably 8 to 10,000. And these weren't uncommon days. There was multiple days like this. I would say probably this was one of the worst ones because I remember it so clearly. But as I'm driving home, I just started to weep in the car because I felt so out of control. I felt so much like how am I ever going to drive past a donut shop or a fast food place or see cake in the office and not be able to control myself? Uh, it's fucking terrifying. And as I'm weeping and basically crying out to God, like, fuck this. How do I fix this? What is wrong with me? About 20 minutes of that in the car. And there was just kind of this settling peace. And in the midst of that, I don't want to say I heard a voice because there was definitely nothing audible, but I definitely felt for the first time like the universe or God, or however you want to think about that, was communicating with me. And the one thing that was evidently clear was that I needed to tell somebody about what was going on. And the voice that I heard specifically was, "You need to tell your wife." So that was the consciousness that came in. And as soon as it came in, I knew it was the right thing to do. So I get home that night from work, and I tell my wife I need to talk to her. We sit down and I lay out everything that I just laid out to you, exactly how the day went. Um, and I cannot tell you how much, the second I was done, how much a weight was lifted from my shoulders. The confession and the being honest about it for the first time in my life was so liberating that I immediately started to understand that I could not hold these things in, that the only way to create change and control around our coping mechanisms, at least for me, is to be honest and vulnerable about what we're doing to ourselves. Because if you cannot be honest about your own coping mechanisms, the things that you run to for comfort, you will, if you can't be honest with yourself and other people, then you're never going to be able to change them. Uh, Leaving these things in a dark place only gives them more and more power and control over you. And so this confessional aspect of laying it all out, and granted, my ex-wife did not receive this information well, and to be honest, she kind of destroyed my vulnerability initially around it because of it kind of heaped onto the shame. But the feeling of just confessing it for the first time was so overwhelmingly good and felt so right that even though that was received poorly by the person I communicated it to, I knew that this was the right path. I knew that and beyond this, it was the first time, and this is still a struggle in my life, but it's far less of a struggle than it's ever been before. And that was the beginning of change for my coping mechanisms. So a few things here. For me, if there is something that you're not sure about in your life, and I know this for myself, the fastest way to root it out and figure out if it's a problem is just cut it out of your life for a long enough period of time that it's hard to not miss it. So, and for the most part, this is usually requires 6 months to a year of delayed gratification. But if you, for example, say, hey, I'm going to stop drinking alcohol, and you can't not drink alcohol for 6 months, if that time frame is too long, then there's a good chance you have an unhealthy relationship with those things. And some people will say that's extreme. Sure, I tend to operate a little bit more comfortably in extremes, but if we want to get to the root of what we're feeling, and our feelings are critical because they dictate a huge portion of the satisfaction that we feel in this life, then we have to root out the things that are making us feel like shit. And coping mechanisms are the first one. So being able to identify your negative coping mechanisms and setting up a process of how you're going to manage them is a critical aspect, and probably the first thing that needs to happen post catalyst event. So if you want to change your life, knowing what your negative coping mechanisms are and having a plan to manage them. If I had not done that, I would not be where I'm at today. I would not be capable of, having healthy relationships with just about anybody, because if you can't be honest with yourself, there's no way in hell you're going to be honest with anybody else. And that starts by talking about the shit that you're going through and what you're struggling with. So next time, we'll talk a little bit more in line with what happens after this. If you're interested in more of this, hit like or subscribe and follow along with this journey. See you next time.